Our core mission is to make the world's roads and drivers safer. And the way that we do that is by measuring sensor information that comes primarily from smartphones and IoT devices.
Everyone knows that you can get a ticket for looking at your phone. That everyone knows that it causes more accidents, right? Staring at your phone while you're driving, but everyone still does it.
There's some drivers that are just harsh breakers and habitual breakers. There's some that engage in a ton of phone distraction.
The vast majority of those crashes are because of human error.
When you said fuel, sort of alarm bells went off in my head, right? Because gas has been quite expensive and, kind of going up and down, but more up than down, I guess you would say, over the past couple of years.
Welcome to the RideShare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry, straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
All right, so today I'm excited to be chatting with two folks from Cambridge Mobile Telematics. We've got Ryan McMahon, who's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development, and Ahbi Butchibabu. She's Senior Director of Product and works on IoT products for rideshare safety. So, I know that I'm very familiar with the company and what you guys are doing. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today and talk a little bit about what you're doing for drivers, for gig workers, for safety in general. I would love to start with what CMT does, Ryan, because I think it's a company you guys have a lot of partnerships and you're doing a lot of work, but I'm not sure that everyone outside the mobility world has heard of it. So what's the pitch?
Well, thanks, Harry, for having us on. Really excited about the opportunity to connect today. Obviously, huge proponents and huge fans of the podcast, the blog, longtime consumer of the great content that you guys put out. And CMT is a really interesting company. It was actually a startup that grew up here. We are sitting on the campus at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the company was started with the theory that we could use sensors to help determine key environmental factors about roadway safety. And actually, the first use case was a product called Pothole Patrol, which was using sensors that were put into taxi cabs in Boston to help determine where potholes were. And over time, what happened is the insurance industry realized that the same sensors that could detect a pothole could also help predict the likelihood that a driver gets into a crash. So our core mission is to make the world's roads and drivers safer. And the way that we do that is by measuring sensor information that comes primarily from smartphones and IoT devices, but increasingly connected vehicles, cameras, and other sources to help determine what elements of driving are most likely to lead to adverse outcomes, to crashes, and then use that information to help reduce that through feedback and incentives. And the incentives, for the most part today, are delivered through the insurance industry. So the insurance industry is CMT's primary customer today. We work with 21 of the top 25 insurance carriers in the US. Oh, wow. About $4 billion of insurance premium discounts are given based on our technology, which is essentially, again, using, for the most part, a smartphone app that consumers download. They use that app to help determine the likelihood that their behavior contributes to a crash or not. And the insurance companies give discounts to those individuals the safer that they are. We're talking about things like harsh acceleration, harsh braking, speeding, cornering, and distracted driving. So the company is really inside of a lot of other products and not necessarily known as a brand by itself. But
got it.
If one of the listeners of the podcast has ever had a usage-based insurance policy, it's pretty likely that the technology is developed by CMT.
Very cool. No, that's a great explanation. And so it sounds like you said, there isn't a CMT app that I'm downloading as a consumer, but if I've got insurance with Progressive and they have an app, and it sounds like that, you guys kind of use the telematics there to sort of see the driving behavior and I guess provide that feedback to, basically say, hey, you're braking too much. And if you drive safer, we'll give you a discount on your insurance. I guess, is that sort of the gist?
Braking is always a good thing, by the way, Harry. We always want people to brake and not go the other way. But here's the thing, right? So 95% of the accidents or crashes, really, 95% of crashes, according to the Federal Highway Administration, the cause of those crashes is human error. And there's so much work that goes into autonomous driving. It gets all of the, the rage, all the big, articles are all about the future of autonomous driving. But the world around us today, the roads, 42,000 individuals are killed on the roads every year. And that's just in the US, by the way. The global number is much larger, and CMT works around the globe in about 18 countries. And really, the vast majority of those crashes are because of human error. And when you think about the feedback that we get as drivers, it's pretty limited, right?
Yeah.
Like, you may have a passenger in the car. Maybe Ahbi and I are driving together somewhere, and Ahbi gives me very polite feedback and tells me that I need to drive safer. That's one way. Perhaps you get a friendly visit by law enforcement on the side of the road that tells you to slow down, or there's road signs that are instructing individuals. But the core really of understanding how safe you are and how your behaviors are contributing to your own likelihood of getting into a crash has been limited because technology didn't really allow that. And it wasn't really until CMT pioneered this technology, and now it's incorporated into lots of different approaches. And as more sensors become available over time, the ability to understand actually what causes risk advances over time. So that's really the baseline of it. It's helping drivers understand that. And what's amazing is these incentives are aligned because the insurance industry wants to reduce crashes because they pay the dollars out when those things happen. So it's good for the consumer, it's good for the insurance industry, and it's certainly good for all of us that share the roads with other people. We want people. At my trip into Cambridge, Massachusetts today, right to my left, there was someone in a car, with their phone, right in front of their face. And it's just so prevalent. And, the question is, how do we stop that? With the effort this far has been communication and tickets, but it's still huge. I mean, 30+% of all crashes that we measure and detect crashes in real time. We send help to a scene and we can reconstruct a crash. But 30% of the crashes that we measure, someone's holding the phone actively when they crash. Wow. Right? So it's a problem that's not solved yet. So our technology and then the incentives that are layered in by our customers are changing road safety.
Yeah. So I think the key word that you said is incentives, right? Because obviously everyone knows that you can get a ticket for looking at your phone. That everyone knows that it causes more accidents, right? Staring at your phone while you're driving, but everyone still does it. And kind of like you said, I think it's probably gotten way worse over the years. It's interesting that 30% of accidents, someone's literally actively holding their phone. I'm sure there's others where, it's mounted on their dash and they're still looking at it. So even higher than 30%, but it doesn't seem like that stick approach is working. So I sort of like the carrot, right? The incentives. Everybody wants to save money. Gas prices are high. Inflation is high. Insurance is very expensive. And so it seems like the technology, what I love about the technology is that it closes that loop, right? If you do drive safely, right? If you don't look at your phone, we can detect that, we can track that, and we can now, close that loop and give you more savings, it sounds like, on the personal insurance side of things, right?
Yeah, that's where it started for the most part. I mean, the first implementation of the technology was in personal insurance because at that time, that's actually predates rideshare. It predates the gig economy. And if you think about the tie back, you as an individual take an action, you download an app and you enroll in these programs. And prior to our technology, by the way, there were OBD2 programs where someone would plug in something into the car. The challenge with that is not all cars were compatible with all systems, and then trying to know, where that OBD2 port is. In my car, I don't even know if it has capabilities, frankly, for that. But personal insurance was the first use case, but it's not the only place we work, but it certainly is probably the largest single user of telematics today.
Gotcha. And real quick, before we move on to Ahbi, what is the actual technology that you guys typically provide? Is it more of an app-based? I mean, I guess what's the SDK? They put it into different companies' apps. I mean, I guess I'm familiar with the term, but for those who aren't familiar, how does the actual technology work?
Yeah, I mean, the user-facing side of the technology is an app. Okay. And as a consumer of it, and I have this with my insurance company. My insurance company actually gives me rewards. So it's actually not a discount. Every safe trip I have contributes towards things like Starbucks gift cards, discounts on gas, movie tickets. When that was put together, movies were, people still went to the movies, but Avatar, maybe everyone's gonna go back to Avatar.
Yeah, I see one or two movies a year.
Yeah, exactly. But the what's interesting is the user-facing side of it is an app, but the actual technology that runs under the hood is cloud-based. So really, a lot of analytics and AI goes into helping determine the types of events that are going to contribute to an adverse outcome. But the way that our technology is ultimately used in the marketplace is either an SDK is used, a software development kit is used by an insurer or another one of our partners to deliver to their customers, or we build apps that then help provide the same information downstream. And by the way, just to be clear, because this comes up sometimes, Harry, we do not generate any value or share any data whatsoever. It's not a marketing platform. It's not used for any other purpose. The data is used for one thing and one thing only, and it's to determine the likelihood that a driver gets into a crash and to help provide all the things that filter into that. So we don't, as a business, we're not a consumer business. We don't have an ad tech business or a marketing business. That's not it at all. It's really the whole of the company. The mission is to make the world's roads and drivers safer.
Cool. And I guess it uses the accelerometer in your phone or other features that your phone has to sort of track some of this stuff.
Yeah, the base technology, again, the majority of our consumers today, the users today of the technology are through smartphone apps, and that's things using all of the sensors that are available in that case. And by the way, when we talk about distracted driving, it's looking at the sensors of the phone. It's not looking to see if somebody is on Twitter or YouTube or any of those things. There's no content that comes through. It's just the sensors. But increasingly, there's more sensors around us, and we are continuing to help integrate more sensor platforms. And that's really where video has come in and other tool sets.
Very cool. Well, I'd love to, Ahbi, get into some tactical advice for drivers, since, especially in the rideshare and the gig world, believe it or not, folks are driving a lot. They're putting a lot of miles on their car. We usually say, a full-time driver will put over 1,000 miles a week on their car, which is, 4 to 5 times as much as the average driver, right? So accidents are very bad for drivers because not only, does it cost them money, potential injury, but then their car is out of commission. So we hear from a lot of drivers that, like there's a financial cost, but there's also literally, it just like puts you out of commission when your car is your tool. So I would love to know, you talked a little bit about harsh braking, distracted driving. What's like the number one worst thing you can do that causes the most accidents that drivers should avoid?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about safety from insurance perspective or in general from safety perspective, there's two main avenues we think about it. One is around just the complexities around road safety and how does a driver become safer on the road. And then the second aspect, particularly in the rideshare space, is about the interpersonal conflict safety, which is, the rider-driver safety, which plays a huge role on both for the rider, the driver, as well as the rideshare companies involved. So on the road safety front, I think, as Ryan pointed out, our mission is always to kind of think about how to make the world's roads safer. So we actually look at a ton of data. We look at it from the perspective of the driver risk. What can the drivers do to kind of improve their situation? But we also look at it from the perspective of, the vehicles that they're driving. What are the vehicles like, and how much safety do the vehicles actually bring to the table? And then the third sort of aspect we look at is just the road risk. Are the types of roads people driving on actually more risky? Maybe some regionality involved there. So to go to your question around what can the drivers do, kind of focus towards the driver risk, there's a lot that we look at, and not all solution fits for every driver. There's some drivers that are just harsh brakers and habitual brakers. There's some that engage in a ton of phone distraction. So some of the technology that we bring to the table kind of looks at that whole overall landscape and provides kind of targeted sort of behavioral changes and coaching that really makes sense for that driver. One solution kind of doesn't fit for every single driver, and that's something we've learned over time, especially looking at our data.
Gotcha. So I guess, it's interesting that you mentioned, the 3 different aspects of driver behavior, the vehicles. I guess certain things, drivers can control, right? I already have a vehicle, for example, that I'm driving Uber and Lyft. I might want a safer or a nicer one, but it might be cost prohibitive to upgrade. I might live in a certain area. So it's interesting that there's certain things like if you drive day or night, for example, right, that would be one good example. You kind of do have control over that, even though you might make more money at night, but is it worth it, right? Like I'm imagining there might be more accidents at night. We just did a video and an article about, is it worth it to drive during a snowstorm? Because during snowstorms, you know, drivers, there are a lot more people need rides, and when it's raining, inclement weather, right, there's fewer drivers out on the road, so you can actually make a lot of money, but you know, there might be more risk, especially with snow. So I'm curious how you think about, you know, sort of balancing some of those kind of preferences versus, you know, the potential to make more money. What do you think drivers should think about?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we think about risk too, we think about intrinsic risk and extrinsic risk.
Mm-hmm.
Intrinsic is something the driver can actually control,
Yeah.
and extrinsic are controls that are obviously out of their control. So some of the things, as you mentioned, like braking or phone distraction, that's entirely in driver's control as much as possible. I mean, we understand in rideshare too, sometimes they are distracted to try and get the next ride. And so there's oftentimes those situations they're getting into that sort of necessity of the job. But a lot of these things are in control. And yeah, as you mentioned, there are some of the extrinsic risk which we actually put out of the box, like you know, in general, like what are the road types like, or even small things like we look at even sun glare. If they're driving in dusk or dawn times, the lighting conditions, do those things matter? And what we find is that even those small variables have an impact on risk. But oftentimes it's not under driver's control to really change that.
So if there was one thing that you thought drivers should focus on, what would be the one thing that maybe sort of helps them drive a little safer, you know, maybe prevent accidents? Is there one thing you could pick?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think phone distraction is such a huge prevalent reason. It's just growing over time. And I think over COVID times, Ryan, you may know the numbers off the top of your head, but the amount of fatalities we've seen have really gone up in really high rates. And so I think that's one space where I think particularly rideshare drivers could really make a difference, because their job often calls for being a little bit distracted. You'll have to kind of work with these rideshare companies to figure out how to best come up with solutions that can limit that as much as possible. And I think drivers should try and limit that type of phone distraction as much as possible.
Yeah, I think a couple of quick things. The road fatality number, it's a 16-year high on fatalities. So knowing that that's the case is critical. And oftentimes we're talking about what the driver can and can't control. One of the things they certainly can control is defensive driving too, right? So you can't count on the other drivers to see you today. And you can't count on the fact that your passengers also may not also be aware that there are drivers out there that are distracted, right? So Harry, you're you know, still a driver, so you drive from time to time. So I'll talk, you know, friend to friend in this case. I would say as much as possible, as many things as you can remove from your tasks while you are actually physically driving the vehicle, whether that be phone distraction or otherwise, is really critical, really, really important. And it's not just, again, the fact of like using your phone while you're driving, because when you do that, it takes your attention away from being a defensive driver and the ability to look out and be aware of other individuals, because that number, the 16-year high, it actually pairs with a rise of about a 30% rise in distracted driving minutes per drive hour on the overall road starting when the pandemic started. So you can take actions yourself, right? One of those actions is to not use your phone while you're driving, right? And I have been in a car with people that were shopping for watches while, you know, getting a ride. And this was actually a taxi in this case in New York City. And I was just super uncomfortable. And I mentioned it to him, and, you know, he stopped. And I think that we get lulled into this sense of security when driving, because most trips don't end in an adverse reaction. But, you know, we're talking about the number of people that die in car crashes is about the same as the number of people that die from breast cancer every year. It's a huge number, you know, in excess of 42,000 people that they started a trip with no expectation that it was going to end in tragedy, and it does. So I think number one, putting the phone down while you drive, it gives you two benefits. Number one, it keeps your eyes on the road, but also makes you a more defensive driver. And especially in a situation, if you have passengers, helping those passengers as much as possible be aware of the fact that there are other people. I mean, a lot of the rideshare apps do great things, and they say, hey, you're entering an area with bicycles, be careful when you open the door, those type of things. But, you know, one of the things that's just present, it's omnipresent, is the amount of time that people are actively holding and looking at their phone while they're driving. So I think that's the number one piece of advice. Whatever you can possibly do to set yourself up so you are not using your phone. And the real problem is that it's not necessarily the rideshare app or the gig app or any of those. It's all the other things. It's email, it's text, it's all the things that we have now dedicated our lives to these little black mirrors. And unfortunately, they take our attention away. So that is the number one thing that I would give people tips. So if you need an incentive, to help that, it's the same type of thing with a lot of behavioral elements. Sometimes we need a little bit extra, but the first thing is putting a mirror up to the situation, right? In a continuation of the conversation, we don't really know how much distracted driving we have as individuals. So when you use one of these apps, you kind of get a sense for yourself about, wow, it's actually a lot more than they may have thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because I'm sure that, if you ask people, right, hey, how often are you looking at your phone while you're driving? I'm sure most people would underestimate the amount of time, or say, oh, I try to do it only at red lights. But obviously, and the notifications is interesting, right? Because like I'm someone, I try to keep most of my notifications off, more just so that I could focus when I'm working, and less because of driving. But I feel like that's a good reason too for when you're driving. I mean, if you could see a text message or an email come through, it's hard not to look at it, right? It's like, oh, wow, I've got that little thing flashing, or that number, just popped up. So I think kind of preventing yourself from even wanting to look at it in the first place. And, I think the distracted driving, it might be, I don't know that it would be the easiest thing to change, right? Because it is a habit that everyone knows that it's not safe, but they do it anyways. But I do think it might be the thing you could potentially have the most control over, right? Other things like braking and acceleration. I mean, if you're driving in a big city like LA or Boston, there's a lot of crazy drivers out there. And so, sometimes you can't really help. You have to drive a little bit more on the aggressive side. So I like the defensive driving too. I think kind of assuming, that everyone else out there is about to hit you, or, assuming someone's going to left turn into you, or assuming other people are on their phone. I think that, driving is a skill, right? And so if someone's driving for money, it is important to sort of polish your skills.
Yeah, it helps in lots of different ways, like reviews, right? That's a big part of things. Comfortable rides, safety rides.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention that, oftentimes we get, as Ryan said, we get lulled into the comfort of, I'll just look at that one quick text and then I'll put it away. But what we've also found is that one quick text actually has lingering effects, cognitive effects. Even if you've put the phone down, it takes a few seconds for your brain to actually start to focus on the road and pay attention. So the ramifications of that quick text or a notification or a call is huge, and it lingers for a while.
We call it the distraction hangover, actually.
Me too.
And it is interesting because, we think that after we put the phone down and away, you're back good. But, what actually we see is that the amount of hard braking that occurs right after a distraction event ends is much higher than it would be otherwise. So, and when we say hard braking, by the way, people might say, oh, I have to hard brake because something happens. Well, what happens overall, we're looking at like data from billions of trips, right? The amount of data is significant. And it's the preponderance of the activity over time, not one or two.
Right.
You slam on the brakes because somebody, there's a ball bouncing across the street. That's obvious, right? You do that. But following too closely on the 405 and having to constantly have a hard braking event. In a hard braking event, the best way I can explain it to people is your seatbelt tightening. This is not like a regular brake kind of thing. It's like one of those things that you're feeling it in the action itself. So, there are ways that we can certainly drive safer. And the real problem is connecting this back to insurance, Harry, is like people spend a tremendous amount of their hard-earned money on insurance, which you have to have. You have to have it if you are licensed in every state except for, if you have a car registered in every state except for New Hampshire. I don't know if you knew that or not, Ahbi, but you don't need insurance in New Hampshire. However, if you have a car loan or you ride or you drive for one of the gig platforms, you certainly do. And unfortunately, those costs keep going up. They're rising significantly in the background. So anything that people can do puts them in a better place for it.
Definitely. Well, so the last thing I'd love to talk to both of you about is sort of this interplay between, rideshare drivers and platforms or just fleets in general, right? Because there is, like on the personal side, right, insurance costs are going up. I think we've seen stats and data, there's more accidents happening. And then, even with Uber, for example, they're now showing drivers on their trip receipts the amount, the commercial insurance that basically they're paying and the drivers are kind of indirectly, or customers, I guess, are paying for. And, that money doesn't go to Uber. It doesn't really go to drivers. So it's sort of a big number, right? And so I think this is a big focus. I'm curious to know sort of what are the opportunities to improve things on the insurance side? And I guess that would be less accidents, which then means less cost of insurance, which then means passengers pay less, drivers might make more money, even the platforms might make more money. I think you said something earlier, Ryan, that the incentives are all aligned. And that's kind of what I love about these insurance opportunities is that, if there's less accidents and, everybody can kind of potentially benefit, right?
Yeah, I think there's something interesting, and it's funny, Harry. You mentioned the word accidents, and I spend a lot of time with road safety experts and advocates, and they abhor the word accident.
Oh, really?
They like the word crash, and the reason for that is because back to like what's the cause of the accident, and 95% of it again is human error.
So it's
And
not
if
an
we go back
accident;
to
it's
this,
a purposeful crash.
right? It might not be intentional. Most of them are not. Most people do not intentionally create crashes.
Right.
Some people do. There are certainly fraudulent crash rings and things that happen, and that we all pay for that and what we pay. But when we think about it in context of the fact that every time that there's a crash on the road, for the most part, something could have been done to change the outcome. Whether it would stop the crash completely or reduce the total severity of that crash. There's something that could have happened to change the outcome of that. So the insurance industry knows that, and we've worked with insurers all over the globe on this. And these concepts actually have been done in contests too.
Mm-hmm.
There was a write-up by the Federal Highway Administration on safest driver programs. There was a safest driver contest in Boston, LA, San Antonio, and Seattle. And there's also been these programs that have run in different countries around the globe. And in each case, there was reductions in distracted driving and at-risk speeding and hard braking. So the cool thing is when those same concepts are applied, whether to insurance, fleets, or any other purpose, they have similar effects. So ultimately, the capability to change the amount of crashes that occur and the severity of those crashes is in our control as society, as a business, as an individual. So when we think about this broad scale, we think about controlling the costs that go into insurance. Insurance is effectively a business that is a bank for risk. The insurance company collects money and they hold on to it until the time that they have to pay dollars out because that car needs to be fixed, or because there's somebody that needs to be compensated because they were hurt, or somebody else's car needs to be fixed, right? It's that simple of a business, and there's really not a tremendous profit margin. It is not a heavy profit margin business. It is a heavy dollar allocation business, but ultimately speaking, those dollars mostly all go back out the door to resolve those elements and to maintain the operation. So the more that you can actually change the underlying economics through these strategies, you can get there. And Ahbi's looked at this from a fleet perspective. There's a couple really interesting elements that fit into this.
Yeah, and I think you were kind of suggesting this too, Harry, where commercial insurance, just in terms of Uber's commission, it's about 50% of it, and it's growing at about 15 to 20% year over year. So it's got this high growth, and this number is only going to get worse. And it's not something I think an individual driver can try and control and fix. It kind of has to be a more holistic approach that we take with the insurance companies, the rideshare companies, and the driver together to come up with a solution that makes sense. I think, for example, in the world of claims, if you get into a crash, litigation costs are increasing exponentially year over year. And so what happens is oftentimes when you get out of airports like Las Vegas, you'll see all these billboards that say, hey, did you get into an accident, a rideshare accident? Let me contact you. It's turned into a big business because these claims have extremely high dollar limits. I mean, in Las Vegas, it's about $1.5 million, which is extremely high. And so people have made it a business to just start to litigate and lots of lawyers getting involved. So one thing that might help here for drivers could be to have a dash cam that allows them to kind of, figure out the fault at fault and get resolution as quickly as possible. But ultimately, getting as much visibility out there like that, like dash cams, can really help reduce the insurance costs over time and possibly reduce this growth that's growing at 15 to 20% year over year.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something interesting, right? It seems like you guys have done a really good job on the personal side. You're partnered with, I think you said 21 of the top 25 companies. And Ryan, I think the rewards program you mentioned is really cool. And I imagine that works pretty well for as far as aligning incentives. I want to drive safer if I benefit financially or get rewards. And I think sometimes what's tricky on the platform side is that you see these insurance costs are so high, but if I drive safer in the short term, I don't actually get any benefit, right? It's kind of more of like a longer tail, or maybe eventually I might get a benefit. And sometimes in the past, I think platforms have even sort of, sent out kind of like big brothery type notifications like, hey, you're not driving safe, or riders are complaining. So it's sort of like, I'm wondering like, what is the best way to connect and sort of align the incentives on the platform side? Dash cams, I think, is a really good example where, as a driver, I recommend, Ryan, I think you've read my book. I think dash cam is one of my top 2 or 3 recommendations for drivers. For one, really more for safety, right? For like passenger and driver safety, right? If there's a dash cam in the car, passengers see a little blinking light, they're like probably going to behave better, right? If something does happen, you have video evidence. And then the secondary benefit, I think, for an Uber or Lyft driver is sort of more on the insurance side. But I imagine, the platforms might care more about the insurance, right? For example, and getting that claim resolved a little bit quicker. So I think that's kind of a cool example of something where everyone benefits from if, every driver had a dash cam.
On the individual side, I'll just say though that if you get into a crash, Harry, there's going to be a lot of negative outcome for you.
Yeah.
So while the overall platform costs may be what they are and out of your control as an individual driver, what you pay for insurance is under your control relative to not paying 50 to 100 or 200% more by getting into a crash. And, rideshare insurance is already a big expense. The reason for that, again, is the core costs that go into and insuring any gig element is just higher than it would be for you as an individual. So one of the things that I would certainly recommend is just get a good understanding of your own risk profile for yourself. You can download our app, Safest Driver. It's not a commercial app. It's not used for, the data is not used for anything. In this case, just for you. There's also an app called Open Road, which helps with crash detection. So in that case, if you get into a crash, emergency response goes out. Again, no commercial business here. This is just an R&D product. And the last thing is Fuel Star, which is our newest product. And here's the real cool thing is, turns out that a lot of the elements that lead to crashes, those same behaviors, actually consume more fuel. So that is something that is early research that we've done, but the connection between driver behavior, safety, and dollars is huge. So while, again, over time, these things will certainly reduce overall platform costs, and there's a lot of really interesting things relative to that perspective from a fleet perspective. But if you, as an individual, I think getting a good handle on how your driving style is contributing to your risk, as well as what you're paying for fuel, both of those things eventually will help you at least keep costs as controlled as possible.
Definitely.
And this is a great example of really aligning with driver incentive of reducing those fuel costs for them, but also helping the platform in some way.
Yeah, no, I think when you said fuel, sort of alarm bells went off in my head, right? Because gas has been quite expensive and, kind of going up and down, but more up than down, I guess you would say, over the past couple of years. And so I think that, to me, especially for rideshare drivers, right, that are doing 1,000 or more miles a week, gas is so tough because it's an immediate expense. You might fill up 1, 2, 3, 4 times a week. And so when you see, when prices fluctuate by 10 or 20%, you see it right there at the pump and it's coming out of your pay. You have to work more or you're making less, right? So it's kind of pretty painful when gas prices go up for drivers. And I think that actually, to me, would be really motivating, right? Hey, if I actually accelerate a little bit smoother, brake a little bit smoother, and that has an impact on my miles per gallon, and I can get better gas mileage, that to me is really motivating. Even though it's sort of like, it should be motivating that it's safer to drive that way. But I don't know. It's just like my honest reaction was like, oh, fuel savings. Oh, okay, sign me up. Yeah,
there's a feedback loop, right? And there's so many things in our life that are like this. It's like what we eat, it's our exercise patterns. There's so many things. The difference with this is they're catastrophic, right? Crashes are catastrophic. And in our business specifically, you start to really see the impact of being able to change the dynamics. And then you also see the other side. And I think because we're just so used to it, you know, especially in Southern California, I think LA County is the #1 most pedestrian fatalities of anywhere in the US. It's also, you know, a huge population, but on a per capita basis, I believe is #1. And these are preventable elements. And I think if, as long as we are conscious about them, we get better results. And our technology is really designed to bring people conscious. The fuel element is a great way because it's for you as a driver. Obviously, that feedback loop is much quicker on fuel. By the way, that app is only on iOS right now. It's an early R&D, but we're pretty excited about the findings, which are the safety elements and the fuel consumption are very, very, very tightly connected.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting. I actually really, maybe we'll check out those apps and do a review on our YouTube channel, because I like the idea of that safest driver, right? Like right now, if I'm kind of someone who cares about that, you know, like some app that, you know, smart app that tracks it all and tells me how I'm doing, and I can see, you know, oh, if I actually change my behavior, if that's making an impact, and especially on the fuel star. So we'll take a look at those. I think that could be really beneficial for drivers. So, you know, I think everything we've discussed has been super interesting. Super cool. I love, you know, we talked about aligning everyone's incentive and some of the opportunities. You know, I'd love to end on, you know, sort of what's next for CMT. Are there things you're working on the product or technology or partnership side, or, you know, just sort of what you guys are both most excited for in the future in this space? Since obviously you have a lot of passion, and I think definitely bringing, you know, positive outcomes potentially to, you know, a lot of different areas, whether it's saving people more money or reducing crashes or accidents or road deaths. You know, anything and everything. Now I'm thinking about it. I'm not supposed to say accidents, right?
It happened to me. Like literally, and I can't even listen to it anymore. It drives me crazy.
I know.
Right?
You're like,
but you know what? If you change your mindset around it, that it is there was behavior that led to it, then it makes it. I mean, you know, accidents happen all the time.
Yeah.
But you know, the more that we can do to prevent it. You asked what's exciting. I mean, for me, and I'll let Ahbi add into this. I think we're doing a lot of work on context and understanding how every situation presents variables and risk. Like you mentioned, snow, right? If you're driving in snow, what factors when driving in snow are more significant relative to the outcome of that? And there's so many things that happen when you think about context. It's really unending, because safety is a continuum. And, you know, you could be the safest driver in the world and think that, you know, driving 55 miles an hour on a 55-mile-an-hour road is safe. It may not be. It may not be. It may be the case is very different. And certainly in your neck of the woods. Ahbi, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to add to what Ryan's saying, we're also thinking about ways to collect data in the most interesting ways that's you know, protecting driver privacy and security of their data. So we've been investing quite a bit in, you know, IoT devices where we have tons of different purpose-built IoT devices that we built that make sense for rideshare, some that make sense for a fleet, some that make sense for personal auto, to try and get data that makes sense to really solve this mission that we have to make the world's roads safer.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I'm definitely excited to try out a few of these apps you mentioned myself. I think the Fuel Star and what were the names of those couple apps?
Open Road. Actually, let me give you one plug for Open Road that is
we'll leave a link in the show notes too, since I couldn't even remember the name.
Yeah, give me one thing here on Open Road. Actually, this happened last year. Somebody wrote a review or wrote a note into us that their life was saved because of the app, because they had a heart attack, went off the road, and the app detected it. They didn't pick up the phone when it happened. Emergency services were dispatched right there, revived the person, and helicopter transported him. So no cost. Again, it's not a commercial product. It's an R&D element for us. And if it helps save a life, that's pretty damn cool.
Very cool. Yeah, very cool. I like that, and the safest drivers. So we'll definitely be checking those out, and appreciate all the work and for both of you for coming on the podcast. Is there anything, if folks want to learn more about what you're doing or CMT, where should they go? We'll leave links to those few apps, which I think might be nice. And anything else you guys want to say, feel free.
CMT.ai, nice and simple.
All right.
Just check out CMT.ai.
Cool. Appreciate it.
So thanks for having us, Harry.
Thanks, Harry.